with me. I am a huge fan of you and your novel, and it's just like the honor of a lifetime to be here with all of you. I feel like I'm getting married again. And because I had a COVID wedding and a regular wedding, it's basically my third wedding that I had. So thank you all for being here. So I'll just do a very short reading from the very opening of the novel, and then we'll chat, and then we'll all hang out. So I'll read the epigraph too. С вами хорошо, а без вас еще лучше, which is a Russian proverb that means, with you it's good, but without you, it's even better. Spending time with my sister, Debbie, was like buying acid off a guy you met on the bus. You never knew if it would end with you, euphoric, tanning topless on a fishing boat headed for Ensenada, or coming to in a gas station bathroom, the insides of your eyes feeling as though they'd been scraped out with spoons. Often, it was both. The first time Debbie took me to Salvation, she dressed me in a highlighter pink bandage dress with cutouts up the sides. She wouldn't let me wear a bra. Nipple outline is part of the look, she insisted. We were at her apartment, a dingy West Hollywood complex with permanent pigeon shit stains on its maroon awnings. She lived there with her on-again, off-again musician boyfriend, Dominic, who was really just an addict with a guitar. He wrote songs with names like Heroin and Salty Surprise. If he'd ever made money off his music, it left his hand before it reached his wallet. I watched Debbie do my makeup in her filmy bathroom mirror. She held a smoky eye palette in her palm like a clamshell, lips parted as she painted my face. Debbie had big blue eyes and a pout that made men do stupid things. People said we looked alike, but no one ever mistook one of us for the other. Debbie wore her body like she owned it. For me, it was the other way around. She was only 5'2", but that made her more powerful. You could fall asleep spooning her and wake up with a screwdriver pressed to your throat. She was so alive, it was scary. I could hear her heart beating from another room. Sometimes she bruised herself sleeping. Her blood was that close to the surface. She powdered the corners of my eyes, and I could count every flag of dead skin on her lips. Her breath smelled of barbecue chips. She'd sucked the blackheads from her nose with a pore strip earlier, but she intentionally left a cluster above her right nostril. Making one imperfection visible makes another invisible, she explained. So this was why she'd half-heartedly tweezed my eyebrows, to distract from the way my ears poked out of my hair, how my bottom lip was thicker than my top. I craned my neck to watch myself transform in the mirror. Stop moving, Debbie said, forcing my head back. Keep your eyes on me. She didn't want me to learn how to do my own makeup. It would upset our dynamic of her as artist and me as canvas. I was 18 and had just graduated high school. My plan was to do 2 years at Valley College and transfer to UCLA. I couldn't decide whether to study English or biology, so I was considering registering for classes in both. Debbie planned the night out as a graduation present. Drinks are on me, she said that afternoon, which meant that she'd had a good shift at the strip club. I occasionally kept her company in the dressing room as an excuse to get out of the apartment I shared with our mother. And, okay, maybe I got something out of the dressing room too. With so many tits, tattoos, and sequins flying against a fluorescent sky, it was easy to miss that the teen girl doing her homework hadn't flipped a page in the last hour. I watched the women as casually as I could, pretending I was checking out their outfits and not them. Occasionally, one of them held my gaze. I imagined following her out of the club, wrapping myself around her in the backseat of her car, kissing her neck as she lifted my shirt, demanding to see me now that I'd seen her. Holy shit, Debbie said. My best work yet. She stepped aside so I could see myself in the mirror. My eyelids were a gradient from silver to galaxy black. The wings of my eyeliner sharp as needles. Lips the color of honey and more symmetrical than I'd ever felt. Do you like it? She said. The uncapped lipstick in her hand was called Toxic. I looked icy and confident. Unfocusing my eyes, I pretended I was looking at some other girl entirely. It's perfect, I said. Salvation was in a rapidly gentrifying part of East Hollywood, on the same block as a hipster coffee shop, karate studio, taqueria, and weed dispensary. The bar was nondescript from the outside, announcing itself with a flickering lime green neon sign. There was no line. The bouncer asked for our IDs, and I slipped him my fake. He barely glanced at it before stamping my hand with a crucifix. I felt a surge of protest, a desire to declare I was Jewish, but the only Hebrew I knew was the wine prayer our father used to recite ironically. My discomfort at being inked with Christian insignia was half-hearted and came from the part of me that wanted to be rewarded for acting correctly. Being a person didn't come naturally to me the way it seemed to for others. People who were sure of themselves awed me. I studied them and tried to mimic their ease. Sometimes I got away with it, but never with Debbie. She saw through me down to my bones. We spent the night chatting up strangers and people Debbie knew from previous nights out. There was Grant, who'd moved to Los Angeles from Idaho to become an actor and had so far only booked a community theater production of Starlight Express and gay for pay porn. There was Ashley, an energy healer who'd been wearing a jade egg in her pussy for 2 years to convert her traumas into sexual energy. And there was Karina, who gave us mystery pills as my graduation present. I tried a few things with Debbie before, but I'd known what they were ahead of time. Weed, coke, acid, molly, benzos, some opiates. This pill was round with the number 30 imprinted on it, a moody brown that reminded me of Venice Beach at dusk. So nice of you, I said with a plastered-on smile, but I'm good. Really? Debbie said. Come on, live a little. We're celebrating. Her eyes were bleary, and she kept licking her lips. She must have taken something before we went out. I'm not in the mood, I said. She rolled her eyes at Karina, who was pretending not to listen. I get it. College girl is too refined to slum it with us. Debbie was waving her hands and knocked over a house of cards that the men next to us had started building. Every card was a 5 of clubs. They glared at her, and she glared back until one of them whimpered. I'm not going to let anything happen to you, Debbie said. Don't you trust me? I'll stop there.
Oh my gosh, I can't get over that opening. Is this on? Can you hear me? I am so happy to be here and talking about this novel with Ruth. I'm such a fan of Ruth and this novel. I read a copy of this while I was doing a cross-country road trip, and I was like, I don't really care about the Grand Canyon. I need to get back and finish this book. It was just that spellbinding. So I'm so happy to be able to be here talking about it with you. To start, let's see, so you read the book's epigraph, which I think is perfect. With you, it's good, but without you, it's even better. So I love the story. I love the stories of epigraphs, like knowing where they came from and how it came about. So where did this come from?
Well, this is a phrase that shows up a lot in my house growing up. I think my parents are out walking with my baby, but we have a lot of like bitchy Russian proverbs going around pretty much at all times. And that's like a classic when like you have guests that come over and it's like time for them to go. You know, it's like it's a joke, but it's also like, okay, like it was like it's kind of like it was fun, but not that fun.
Oh my gosh, I love that.
Yeah. Russian has a lot of like really vulgar proverbs too, which are fun. A few of them made their way in here, but I just felt like opening with like something that's like a little bitchy, a little fun, a little mysterious. It kind of felt like the vibe of the book.
Yeah, it really sets the tone. I feel like this book is so hilarious, but also really dark. And a lot of the time those things are very intertwined. There's a lot of really dark humor. So can you talk about how you link humor and tragedy together in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that humor is, you know, one of the best responses to tragedy or one of the best ways to cope with it. I think that, you know, both in my life and in the book, there's a very like post-Soviet Jewish orientation toward life, which is like the dark humor. there's a grandma character in the book who's just constantly like regurgitating these like super traumatic stories about just people being murdered in the streets and like in ditches and stuff, and she just like blasts them as if it's like out of a t-shirt gun, to the point where it's like the stories are horrible, but like it's kind of funny because you're just trying to like eat some jam on toast at like your friend's birthday party at the bowling alley or whatever, and suddenly everyone's like sitting with like the generational trauma of like eight generations of ancestors. So I feel like humor is really useful for kind of getting at that kernel of truth of how historical traumas affect people, not just the people it happened to, but the people several generations removed. I think humor is kind of an interesting way of getting to it at a slant.
Yeah, I feel like I knew we wouldn't be able to get through the reading without talking about trauma, and I did want to talk about trauma because
we have such a fun night ahead of us.
I didn't think it would come this early, but you led me there. So I think that when I read this book, I was like, I feel like this is one of the realest portraits of intergenerational trauma I've seen, but yet it was just so funny and alive and linked with humor. And one of the things I liked about the portrayal of trauma in this book is that it felt like the characters who had undergone trauma were always like measuring it against other people in this way, like, oh, my trauma was worse, so you shouldn't complain, or like their trauma was worse, so I shouldn't complain. Maybe mine's not authentic. Like, and it was it was really funny to read, but struck me as really true. So I just wanted to, like, what were you trying to get across about trauma in this book? Why did you go this route?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think trauma Olympics are totally a thing, right? Of like, but both the need to like defend what you've been through and have people recognize it, but also to minimize it so that you can survive. I feel like everyone's kind of always having like a dick measuring contest around their own traumas personally. So I don't know, I thought that would be like a fun thing to explore. A fun thing to explore in a book in its own way. And I think it also kind of shows how different generations of people respond to things, different kind of immigration timelines. We have some of the characters who actually went through some of those traumas, like back in the Soviet Union. We have a grandma character who is very kind of hardened by it, but sees herself as very put together, like would never go to therapy, would never take an SSRI, like God forbid, and finds it like so indulgent and embarrassing that like she has a daughter who struggles with mental illness and a granddaughter who's the narrator of the book who also clearly has some stuff going on that you might find in the DSM-5. And I think that kind of speaks sometimes to how different generations sort of respond to each other, of like, what's the right way to process traumas? Like, is it to just kind of sit silently with it, not to let anyone see it, because that means that you've kind of overcome it if your baggage isn't out in the street? Is it to be open about it so that other people can connect with you for it, and hopefully that can heal other people too? There's a lot of different opinions on that in the book, and I just wanted to kind of be true to life in that way.
Yeah, I think you balance you portray so many different opinions so well in many different parts of the book. You read a little bit that introduces us to the local bar in the book, Salvation, which is like this amazing, like toxic sort of Cheers bar. Like, what an amazing local bar filled with so many characters. And I know in interviews you've talked about how when you're writing you begin with voice, right? So in this bar there's so many different voices. It's like a big Greek chorus of characters. So how did you go about finding all the different voices for this set of characters?
Yeah, well, it helps that that's exactly the kind of fiction I like to read. Like, I love to read stuff that has these very kind of voicey, stylish, like memorable characters. So like Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson was very big for me, as it was for every like 20-year-old with a creative writing degree. I love to read like Rachel Kushner, Raven Leilani. You are a major voice stylist who is influential for me. I think for me to capture a voice, it's basically like finding like what are the specific kind of like totemic objects and things that like those people would notice in the world, and trying to be like as specific with it as possible. So it's like things that are of the world, like an octopus, like cough drops, colostomy bags, just like things that like are in the real world, and not just like tree, book, mom. So trying to capture like that real specificity of what it feels like to be a person in the world, like that texture. And I think that just as someone who comes from a poetry background, I like my toxic trait is I have to polish every single word and like for some reason every sentence has to sound like it could like stand on alone and be its own poem. Which isn't to say that I think that like the book doesn't have any sentences like the door opened, and then I think that that's like high art, like giving the MacArthur Genius Grant. But as much as possible, I tried to kind of have the whole book be an album with no skips and develop voice that way.
I was gonna say, even when you just named those 3 specific objects, I was like, we clearly have a poet here. You like, if you told me to name 3 objects, I would probably come up with a really boring 3 objects like that. But you, Optimus is so good. But you did, I wanted to talk about the influence of you being a poet, turned fiction writer. You wrote this really amazing essay on LitHub, which was about, how it was for you to focus on your sentences so much and then go about trying to craft a plot into them. I just want to read like a really quick quote from it that I loved. But the sentences slapped. I wrote with the surgical precision I brought to my poems, bled over every word. Was it a great book? No, but it was full of bangers. That's just, the whole essay is that good, so you should really look it up on LitHub and read it. But I really related to this, to really like laboring over the sentences, but feeling like you had to, work in, stakes and events, plot. So could you talk more about how, you found and crafted a plot for your beautiful sentences?
Yeah, I mean, so it always starts with voice for me, like we talked about, and I wrote the novel as if I was just writing a long poem, which is something I only say in events here. A lot of people have already bought the book, because I feel like hearing someone say that, I'd be like, like as much as I think we're having a moment around books that are all vibes and no plot, I don't think this is exactly that. I tried to really have a plot, because it's hard to do just vibes for like 300 pages, at least for me. But when I say I wrote it like a poem, I really wrote in pursuit of like beauty and truth. And I know that sounds kind of like, but that's like really what it felt like for me, was just letting the sentences kind of do all the heavy lifting and let the plot work itself out based on where the imagery kind of took me. So it was a very intuitive process with the first draft. And like I said in that essay, the first few drafts were trash because it was just like beautiful sentences with like major plot holes. So the sentences were not as beautiful as I thought they were. And so it really took a lot of revising, first with my agent and then with my amazing editor Alicia, who's here, to really figure out like, okay, babe, like it's really great that you have a sentence like, and then I got sober. That's like a really interesting idea, but like that's actually its own like 5 chapters in a novel. You can't just like throw in a line like you would in like a poem or a short story and have that, carry the whole plot forward. That's not a plot. So I really relied on my readers to help me kind of figure out like where the sentences were kind of just like a flex, and weren't really serving the book, and where we needed some more connective tissue and scenes. It's very good to have other readers.
I think you did an amazing job. The sentences in this book are absolutely extraordinary, but there is a plot carrying you through. If anyone has not read it yet, I vouch for that. So this book is set, it's mostly set in LA, and it's such a, LA fever dream, but kind of a different LA than you might normally think of, palm trees, Malibu. Like this book is set in a sort of grimier LA, which I love, and significant portions of the book also take place in Moldova. So did you always know you would set the book in those 2 places, and how do you go about, translating a setting onto the page?
With LA, I did know it would be set there, partly because like I don't know how to write another city that I haven't spent a lot of time in. Like as much as I love books that delve into the archive and are very researched, like I love to read that, but that's like not my shit when I'm writing. That just sounds really tiring. Which is also why there's all these scams involving pharmaceutical drugs, because I knew I wanted schemers and grifters, and that's like an area where I could speak to how those scams would actually work, like knowing the law around that as a pharmacist. So it was always going to be LA. I had this image when I was 22 of it's going to be like Jesus' Son, but LA. And it's not heroin, it's prescription opiates. And it's women.
That's such a good
No one's
pitch.
ever done it before. No one's ever done it before, Kyle. So the LA part, it's always been there. And then with Moldova, that part really happened intuitively when I was working on the book with no outline, just trying to see where it would go. I had just been to Moldova with my family for the first time since we ever immigrated. So I hadn't been since I was like 2 years old. I had no memory of it. And that trip totally like clarified a lot of things for me, and it was very surreal. Like for example, growing up in LA, where we go to these Jewish cemeteries that are super manicured, and there's deer and there's bunnies and there's like beautiful flowers, and we go to like movie screenings at Hollywood Forever with like these gorgeous like opulent graves, and then you go to like the Jewish cemetery in Moldova, and it's like broken graves, weeds everywhere. You have to use a pocket knife to bushwhack to find your ancestors. Like there's cigarette butts. Like it's really like a completely different experience, and it connected me to my background in this very visceral way, because like you hear the stories from your family, but it's something else to see it and be like, oh, this is actually even more grim than I pictured in a lot of ways. Yeah.
So you wrote the sections after you had gone back?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, just a few months after.
Yeah, that's great. So you introduced us in your reading to the sister Debbie, who is such an alluring, charismatic, slightly toxic, dare I say, presence in the book. Did this book start with Debbie? Did she come to you fully formed? She's so unique and alluring.
I feel like I kind of like magicked her into being just with the first sentence of the book, which was the first sentence I wrote back when this was trying to be a linked short story collection, because Jesus son. The first sentence was always spending time with my sister Debbie was like buying acid off a guy you met on the bus. And I just like the vibe of that sentence. I feel like when you hear that, it's like, who's on the bus? Like, where's she going? Who's her sister? Like, what city does this take place in? Like, you kind of just, at least I kind of wanted to like follow them and see where the night was going to go. So writing that sentence was what kind of created the sister character. So everything else was formed around that scaffolding of like, what if you described someone from the get-go as like spending time with them as like taking acid from like that you got off of like some rando on LA public transit, like what else is that person like, and what would your life look like if you got off the bus at their stop.
I love knowing that this came from like a Jesus' son seed, because there is a Jesus' son story that really reminds me of that, when he's like following someone off the bus. So yeah. It's beautiful to hear that inheritance. And I love that was the first thing you wrote. I actually love hearing always what the first part of a book was. Do you remember did you write this book chronologically, like all the way through, or how was your writing process with it?
So at first, it was linked short stories, because that just seemed easier than writing a novel. Like, I never thought I'd be able to write a novel, because I had this sense that you needed to have an outline, you needed to know where it was going to go, like to make foreshadowing happen, and good pacing, and payoffs, and deep characters. Like, it just felt like there were so many decisions you have to make that it felt very outside my league. But somehow, naively, I thought like, oh, a short story, like get in, get out, 2,000 words, done. And linked short stories, like it's the same characters, but like different shenanigans. And so I had like 8 short stories that I copy pasted into Word doc and was like, linked short story collection. And then I showed them to an agent had reached out to me after reading some of them in journals, and I showed them to the agent and thinking I had a book, and it was like 48 double-spaced pages after like 5 years of work. And they very gently were like, this wants to be a novel. And at first I was like, an agent would say that, because like novels are so much more commercial and easier to sell, but they were definitely right. Like the stories were not more than the sum of their parts. But so, chaotically what I did was I kept those copy-pasted short stories that were in chronological order in that Word doc, basically made that part 1 and 2 of the book in the first draft, and then just wrote the section starting in Moldova chronologically from there. So then there was a ton of revising to like add connective tissue to the short stories, to write scenes rather than things like, and then I tried to get sober that like covers an entire person's life in like half a sentence. So the first draft was fun because it was so kind of chaotic and experimental, and then the revising is where like the most difficult work happened, to try to reverse engineer a novel basically out of a short story collection and a novella.
You did. It doesn't read at all. It reads very well connected. So you did an amazing job. And you mentioned earlier that you are a pharmacist. So you are a writer with a day job and an important job at that. So how does your daily job affect your writing practice?
I think that the vocabulary of what I do and the way that my mind works at work, I think I can't help but let that filter in. I had a lot of fun thinking about like what kind of like terrible scams could someone get up to, knowing what I know of the laws and like, can you make Medicare fraud a beautiful way of honoring your immigrant grandparents? The book says yes. So that part was fun, and then just being able to describe, how the drugs feel in the body and things like that was fun. And it was also important for me not to do any like moralizing around addiction, because I really don't think that substance dependence is at all a moral failing, and I really wanted to make it clear that just because we're up to a lot of like shenanigans and like very bad vibes in here, doesn't it's not, I'm not coming at it from a place of judgment. And in my day job I have helped people taper off of benzodiazepines and things like that, so I have a sense of how those things often look in real life and tried to make it true to life and not sensational.
Another thing that really is woven through the book is a lot of mysticism and spirituality, whether that is superstitions, various superstitions, or psychics. So why was that an intentional choice to weave it through the book, and why did it need to be in there?
So you, having spent time in LA, I'm sure know that you literally can't walk more than 2 blocks without seeing a psychic shop. And someone on a podcast asked me earlier, like, are those just like mob fronts? Like, how do they stay in business? Like, who's actively going to all these psychics? And now I wonder, like, are they day trading? Like how do how do the lights stay on? So I think that just, growing up in LA and seeing the occult everywhere was a part of it, and being around people who identify as psychics or witches or energy healers, it kind of has been part of the background in which I feel like I was steeped. And I think that mysticism and the occult is an interesting it's an interesting lens for thinking about Judaism and generational trauma and things where I feel like sometimes the way that people process those kind of complicated experiences, or especially people in the Soviet diaspora who are Jewish and identify with that very strongly culturally, but not necessarily in a way that means they go to temple. I think that like the mysticism and the occult can be a really powerful engine for them to feel connected. And superstition is a big part of that too, which was big in my family and comes up a bit in the book. So yeah, I was interested in like generational trauma being sort of like a mist that surrounds these characters and that they're reckoning with, but not like the plot of the entire book. And these kind of drops of mysticism here and there felt like a way of weaving that in without it being too heavy-handed.
I read something that you said in another interview where you said, anxiety is not intuition, and I was like, oh my gosh, and she's right. I think you cured me of some of my anxiety with that.
I need you to like send me a text that says that every night around like 11:05 p.m.
I was like, Ruth, oh my god.
But it feels like that, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
That like feeling of dread. It's like, oh, I'm on to something.
I'm like,
no, you're
I'm
just unwell.
predicting tragedy. Yeah, exactly. Honestly, I wrote that in my journal when I read it. I was like, I think Ruth just cured me of something. So thank you for that. So I'm wondering if, we've talked a lot about how you have begun with voice, and I think you can tell even from just like hearing Ruth talk, like her voice is so strong, and it's really on the page in this really delightful, hilarious, beautiful way. But I was wondering if now that you have gotten into the end of writing a novel, successfully crafted a very good plot, like, are you still starting with voice in your writing, or, is plot something that is coming more naturally to you?
Well, I'm flattered that you think I have other ideas in my head, and that there's another manuscript in the works. Huge if true. I think that with fiction, it's always going to be voice for me, because plot just feels very secondary to me. I like to read things with a plot. Like, I don't want to just read about. Actually, no, I lied. I was going to say I don't want to read about someone just taking the bus for a whole book, like the way that my first sentence was. But that actually kind of sounds like it would slap, like if done the right way. But yeah, I don't think about books in terms of concepts or plots. Like, here are the themes I want to hit. Like, here's like a framing I think would be interesting. It always has to be like an interesting character. Because for me, like if someone has a hypnotizing voice, I'll read about literally anything. I'll pick up novels where the topic just couldn't interest me any less. But if the voice is alluring, that's like all I need. So I feel like that's going to be my disease forever, is only writing that way.
Well, we're very happy that I'm happy you have that disease because it means we will read more of the boys. I mean, you're also just such a prolific writer. You know, you write so many freelance articles and all with the day job. So, you know, I want to hear more about your writing practice. Like, would you write at the same time? Do you just fit in your writing? You also are a new mom. I mean, how do you do it all?
Yeah, I was gonna say anything that was my writing practice before now is just like haha. Like what writing practice? You know, before it was very much about before I had a baby, it was very much about like, you know, fitting writing into any nook and cranny. And I think that, you know, I really have to shill having a day job that's outside of writing and academia if you are a writer. Because I think at least if you're anything like me, it gives you this constant sense of FOMO. Like everyone else is writing while I'm like adjusting people's insulin. Like everybody else is going to see this like writer I admire so much at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday because like they're in an MFA or PhD and they can do that. But like I work until 5, you know. And so it created this sense that like I've like angst to constantly be on my game to keep up with people. And so for like a long time, that was my work ethic, was trying to shove writing in every nook and cranny, like lunch breaks. You know, when I was in pharmacy school, I would get up an hour early to do like 40 minutes of writing, because if you're like me, you have to get up and stare at the wall for 20 minutes first, so you just have to lose that third of the hour. Now, I mean, life got a lot easier in that sense once I had a job that was like an 8 to 5 situation where like when it's done, like lose my number. Unless any of my coworkers are listening on the live stream, in which case text me anytime. I'm available. Patient care is so important to me. But like those boundaries were really helpful. Now with a baby, it's like the only writing I've really done has been related to the book, like the essay you talked about, or things that I had already kind of agreed to write, or author interviews. And those basically only happen if my husband Adam or someone in my family is sitting and entertaining the baby while I like furiously like slam on the keyboard as if there's a gun to my head to like get something done in that hour before she needs to either like sleep or eat or something. But in a weird way, it's made me a more decisive writer. Like the few essays I've had, I've had the delight to write as the book's been coming out. I feel like I've like banged them out so much faster than normal because it does feel like there's literally someone sitting with like a gun to my head. Like this is, you know, these are the 6 hours you'll get across these 3 weeks. Like make it happen or else it's gonna be trashed.
I love the idea of FOMO as motivation too. Yeah, great. Okay, I think we are going to transition to audience questions. Okay, wonderful. Does anybody have a question for Ruth? Yeah, Matt.
You mentioned going to Moldova and then being moved to write about Moldova in the book. While you were on the trip, were you making notes? Were you already thinking, oh, I'm going to write about this? Or were you allowing yourself to really live in the moment, experience the trip? Or was it something in between? I'd love to hear about that.
Well, okay, I'm going to repeat the question.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, just for the live stream. So the question was about how Ruth mentioned that she traveled to Moldova, and you know, while you were there, were you making notes? Did you already know that you were going to set the book there, or did it happen more? I'm sorry, I forgot the exact words. Did it happen more organically? That's the gist of the question.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah, Matt Ortila is an excellent writer and excellent travel writer, so I'm flattered that you would even flatter me with that question about writing on your travels. You know, when I was there, I was taking a lot of notes, not so much necessarily for writing, but just like for my own knowledge, because so many family stories are contextual, right? And there were just so many things that I learned about my family that I feel like would never have come up unless we were in some particular place and something triggered it. And it was also just interesting because it's like, I feel like we all play, those of us who are immigrants, we all play like immigration telephone with the stories that have been passed along. And, you know, I went with my parents, with my aunt and my cousin, and we had some family friends who met us there. And, you know, I heard different versions of the same story from the ones I had heard growing up. And it was, you know, I had to write all that down because it's just interesting to see what changes, what's kind of doubled down on. And, you know, I think I thought that maybe at some point I would get to write about it, but I never knew how. Like, poetry and personal essay felt like way too personal. But fiction has like that really seductive, like plausible deniability. Like, babe, it's not about me. It says a novel. Not that like translates a lot. Like I was just Adam and I compulsively read my Goodreads reviews just because they're like so much fun, especially when they're stupid. And like someone the other day was like, I really hope she and her sister get the help they need.
Debbie, if you're out there.
I know, if you're out there, seek help, find religion.
Oh my gosh, amazing. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matt, for that question. Anyone else have a question? Yes.
Just because you describe Moldova and it's something you saw, you describe grandma and something you live with, you describe this, that's your family, and this and that. Who is the sister?
Who is so the question was that there's all these parallels, like Moldova's in the book, I've been to Moldova, there's a grandma in the book, I have a grandma. Who is Debbie? Who's the sister? She's not modeled on anyone after my own life, and in fact I in very non-subtle terms, the acknowledgments, when I thank my family, I'm like, please nobody assume it's about them. Because I think that, I'm sure you experienced with your novel too. I think it's very easy when you're like, especially like a young woman writing about topics where like you share some biographical similarities. It's very easy to feel like you are the narrator, or like you guys, if you share this, probably you also share that. So yeah, the chaotic older sister Debbie, not based on anyone in my life exactly, but in some ways I think she's sort of like a manifestation of that feeling that I think some of us get in our late teens and early 20s, like something's incurably wrong with me, but I don't want to know what it is. She's sort of a physical manifestation of like someone who says yes to everything, like no impulse control. It's kind of fun to write a character who, her whole like way of looking at life is that like, and she even says this in the novel, is if you're not asking myself, am I about to ruin my life at least once a day, you're basically not living a life at all. And so I thought it'd be really fun to follow a character who like will basically do anything for a good story. And even if the night ends horribly, like at least you've lived, at least you've experienced some other like sheen, or skein of like the living experience. So yeah, it was fun to write a character with basically no impulse control, who's very chaotic and bitchy, but like very, very funny and like a good hang, even if it ends with like the worst night of your life.
She's very fun to hang out with in the book.
I was just trying to prepare Adam for something.
Oh, he knows it all.
Secret sister coming out of the book. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, in the yellow.
Hi, I really like how the narrator sort of, she kind of retains more of mystery by never having her name revealed. I'm curious, was that like a firm decision that you made early on, or was that something that you
Yeah, she's never had a name, and in fact, I don't know her name. I feel like it's none of my business. Our narrator is so consumed with unease over how to be a person and feels like however we are people in the world, she's doing it wrong. And so much of the book is about her trying to like hone some agency and be able to like be the engine of her own life rather than letting everybody else kind of dominate her and guide her. So it felt really hard to like pin down a name. Like, what was I gonna call her? Like Caroline? Like every name felt too specific somehow. And so I wanted people to kind of be able to sort of slip into her skin and not feel like they knew her too well. And yeah, like case in point, like I couldn't even tell you what her name was. I have an idea of the first initial, but even that I feel like is like the tea leaves. Like I might figure out 15 years from now, like that was wrong. It's an X. Xaviera.
Can you tell us the first letter?
I think it might be an S, because there is a line about her being named after a great grandparent's daughter who passed away, and so I had a thought about that without giving any names away.
Yeah, S feels right. Yeah. Thank you. Over here.
Ruth, first of all, just congratulations. Like, I'm so proud of you to sing like all this.
Thanks, Dad.
Even to show you, just talk about the narrator there. You've built such vivid characters and built this whole world for them, and now you've got the book out, and these characters kind of disappear. Do you want to return to these characters? Do you want to just like leave them where they are, give them a new world, or how do you feel about that?
So my friend Seth asked, he said that my character work slaps, and like, do I see myself leaving the characters behind or kind of continuing to world build around them? I don't know. I feel like literary fiction doesn't often have a sequel, right? Like it feels like a very odd thing. Like we have Bottoman, sure, like has done like the Idiot and Either Or, but I can't think of like that much literary fiction where you have like a debut novel and then you kind of follow it up with like related characters. Tell me if I'm wrong though.
Ferrante,
yeah. But I feel like I can kind of count on like one or two hands.
Yeah.
So weirdly, it feels like forbidden to come back to them, even though I might sometime. Like I feel like I could see myself writing some fiction about like short stories about them. But I also want to kind of get obsessed with a new voice. I think that would be fun, even though it's going to be hard to differentiate her from the voice of this narrator because it's been stuck in my head since 2014, which is when I started writing the book. So very, very hard to imagine doubling down on a new voice.
Hi, I loved your book. I have two questions. So one of them is, what was the decision process and why is your character Russian? Obviously it's fiction, so you know, it's not you. But I was just curious about that. And then also, you talked about how in the book there's a lot of different generational ways of dealing with trauma. And I was wondering, like, having written this book, did you find your own relationship to trauma changed at all, or did it help, or like what's your approach to trauma having written a book like this?
So the question was, why is our narrator, why does she have a Russian background? And that there's so many different approaches to like kind of navigating generational trauma in the book, and like have I found any personally helpful or that they speak to me. Why was she Russian? I felt like it was too close to have her be from like Moldova, where I'm from, although we do have a character in the book that we haven't really talked about much, but there's one of the main characters in the book. Her name is Sasha, and she is this Soviet Jewish refugee who claims to be a psychic, and she pops into the narrator's life one day and says that like she's here to be her spiritual guide. And like, is she psychic? Is she grifting? Like, you'll have to read to find out. But she's from Chisinau, which is the capital of Moldova, where I'm from, and I kind of gave her some of my biography because it felt a little too close with the narrator, and the narrator is kind of a several generation American-born person. So, you know, I knew that she was going to have like a Soviet background that helps her connect with this character of Sasha, and that creates kind of a scaffolding for this generational trauma that she and her sister are contending with in their own like vague ways. And yeah, I think like Moldova felt too close. Russian felt usable partly because I speak Russian. That was language we spoke growing up, and that's what a lot of people from the diaspora speak because of like Russian imperialism. You know, I do not speak Moldovan, and my family is from mostly Moldova and Ukraine. Like, I don't speak Ukrainian. And then in terms of different approaches to generational trauma, I think I definitely don't have any answers, but I think that just being open to the idea that things that you didn't personally experience can still have kind of a insidious way of cropping into your life is useful for me nonetheless. Like I never think that it's that helpful of a framing device to think like I am this way because this happened, or like, you know, my mom is this because of this, and that's why my grandma's this, and that's why I'm this, is because we're all this combination. Because I think that we never get that level of clarity in life, like not really, as alluring as it can be to think that there's any sort of A to B that you could draw with human nature. But I was interested in this idea that, you know, these experiences that happen to people who are not you in your family, where you've heard the stories many times, that it could affect you in certain ways, and often ways you're not aware of, but just being open to the idea that those forces are present, and that in a way it's a way of connecting you to your ancestors.
Beautiful, thank you. Yeah.
As we've seen as the rave reviews of your novel and book of poetry, all
Say it a little louder.
Rave
Do you want a mic for that?
But we all agree that you have an ungodly strength when it comes to imagery and the precision of your metaphor and all that stuff. So what I'm interested in is, yes, like your imagery is so visceral, but why does it have to be so like horrifying? Two-part question. One, do you consider yourself a sadist? And
August, my family is here.
But I'm just curious why you lean to a type of humor that's so shocking, unsettling with the imagery choices that you have. Like, yes, humor is a great tool to get to the truth, but your humor is so dark, it's like black tar humor.
Well, part of it, I think, are.
Do you want to repeat?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, sorry. The question was that. Thank you for reminding me. Was that like, why is my humor often so in imagery so sadistic or like so dark? And it's asked by my friend August Lewis, who's also an amazing writer. I think part of it is the people I read. I mean, like Dennis Johnson has that like insane specificity. Like he, in the first story in Jesus' Son, car crash while hitchhiking, there's like a horrible car accident, and the narrator of that book, Fuckhead, that's literally his name in the book, he's in the emergency room, and he's standing next to the room where like a wife is being told her husband died in the car accident, and he says that like she shrieked the way an eagle shrieks or something, and like it sounded like diamonds were being incinerated in there. I've gone my whole life looking for that feeling, like something like that, and like what a gut punch. And I remember Rachel Kushner had this line in The Flamethrowers where something, I forget what it was, but something hangs out of a window like a severed eyeball, and like just I think things like that are really visceral. I feel like they get under your skin and are very memorable in a way that I'm always trying to approximate. Like it doesn't have to be disgusting, but just just like very specific, and often I feel like sometimes the more shocking the image is, the more you get like a little bit of like a sheen of humor with it too. Like I remember you told me, I've never forgotten this, but like, so August and I went on this poetry, we did this poetry program in Paris in like 2014, and you were reading an A.M. Holmes book, and you described this like disgusting passage where these people got into a car accident, and then like when the police looked inside the car, it looked like lasagna. You told me that in 2013, and I've never forgotten it. So I guess like there's your answer. Yeah.
So I think it is.
Yeah. Now that it's all you, and now I've like ruined everyone's night. No one's ever gonna eat Italian food again.
Okay, palate cleanser question. No, we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. So yes.
If it took almost a decade to get your book out, what motivated you to never give up on it?
That's a good question. That's a really good question. The question was, if it took me almost a decade to get my book out, like what motivated me not to give up on it? I just like, I don't know how to read a genre that I like without like insisting on like trying to make people feel the way that like a good book makes me feel. So it's not from like a sense of entitlement, like this is good, this like needs to be in the world, it's gonna help people. It really is just that like I have so much fun reading books that really do something for me, that feel like transcendent and make me feel like happy to be alive because I get to read that book. And it's so much fun to try to approximate that. And no one can, like, I feel like you can never know if your book will be that for anybody, and in fact I would like to urge someone to get help if you think that it is. But it was just fun. I also built up a writing community from taking workshops and meeting a lot of writers online, like Twitter, things like that. And when you're around other creatives who inspire you constantly, it's like a compulsion, and it's fun, and you want to impress your friends, and you want to be contemporaries with and peers with people who you admire. And it's the most fun club ever. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. I over here.
Yes. I was wondering, because we're talking a lot about using humor, and I find it so hard to try to write funny. And so I guess I was wondering, like, when you do it, are you kind of intending to be funny? Like, are you like, I'm gonna write a joke now? Or like, what's your process of how that happens?
So the question was that, do I decide to try to write a line that's funny, or does it just kind of happen? Like, how much intentionality is there with the humor? I think that's just, this is like such a masturbatory answer, but I think that's just my voice. I think I grew up in a family where like humor is so like the page that everyone's on, like, we were constantly laughing, nothing is sacred, basically, like everything can be a joke. And it was fun to imbibe a lot of that energy into the book, especially with like the Russian proverbs and stuff that were like taken directly from things I heard growing up. But I mean, it's a very like post-Soviet Jewish way of looking at the world too, where like nothing is sacred, everything can be a joke, as kind of, I think, a response to tragedy and coping mechanism. But yeah, usually I don't decide like I'm gonna write a funny sentence. Like humor feels like a good fit here. It's more like a compulsion where I can't help but like ring that same bell that I know comes naturally to me, and then have to be told by my agent and editor like 10 jokes in a row too many, like pick your 2 favorites. You know, like there were so many things that got cut because they were just like really fun but like kind of silly and didn't belong. Which is why I wrote that craft essay about like having a Word doc on my computer that's just like a cemetery for all my favorite lines, and insisted on publishing that essay so that like the lines can live on, like everyone must know. So yeah, I think that every writer has kind of the tools that are most natural to them in their toolbox, and for me it's the dark humor. The things that don't come as naturally to me are like just kind of ambient description. Like I feel so uncomfortable describing like the weather, deciding what time of year it is, like what people's like faces and shoes look like. And it's always really revelatory when you read a writer who just like doesn't do that or just does it their own way. Like Mary Gateskill has this short story called The Other Place where she describes a character as middle-aged and fucked up looking. There's no more description than that, but like chef's kiss, like perfect. That's all you need.
Amazing. Well, I think, is that all the time? Yeah, okay, well, I think that that's all. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out to celebrate all my
Thank you. Thank you. I love you all.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight, and thanks to everyone who asked questions, and thank you both for a fantastic conversation. As I mentioned earlier, Ruth will be signing and personalizing books. My coworker Christina is pointing to where that is right now. We just ask that you line up along this center aisle and snake around so that we can start breaking down the chairs, and we will be moving tables throughout the middle as well, just later on. If you're interested in buying Ruth or Kyle's books, we have copies up at the front. And if you need to use the bathroom, we have a public bathroom to your right by the Moleskine Journals. That's it. Let's give these two one last round of applause.
Like a natural chatter. I feel like